the jungle role is often considered by some to be this alpha role, right? To where a jungler has to be very assertive in order to actually be a great jungler within a team environment. And the jungle role in Leu is undeniably in control of the early game, and so that's why a lot of people think that you have to be this very assertive person, because he has the most agency in the early game by far, right? Because no one else has gotten out of lane phase, no one has taken other towers, so lane phase isn't over, and therefore he can turn unfavorable matchups into favorable ones. And this is more specifically pertaining into pro play, because in pro play, generally players know how to lose gracefully within a unfavorable matchup, and they aren't really going to feed their ass off and get solo killed consistently, right? It's only like the very bad LCS players that will really do this. But generally in LCS, or in the league's in the entire world, they won't generally get solo killed all that much. So with the jungler, his role is to actually tilt those matchups into the favor of your ally. And so he can completely snowball an entire lane, and he can also especially take advantage of someone who has a favorable matchup and favorable aggression or priority within their own lane to then control the enemy jungler as well too. So generally, the way that a jungler gets control of another jungler is by playing towards one of his priority lanes. And so therefore, if he has priority in, say, the mid lane, then suddenly he has a huge plethora of different jungle routes that he can take in order to affect the entire map. Maybe he can steal a camp here, he can steal a camp there, and then suddenly he's a level up. And if he ever gets into a fight to where it's, a level 6 versus a level 5 enemy, and he has his own ultimate, it's way within their favor. If it's, say, a 3v3 and maybe the jungler tries to gank a lane and he's there to counter gank, or maybe he's there to just gank a lane anyways and he knows the counter gank is coming, but he already has his level 6, so he doesn't need to worry about that at all. So with this entire whole jungle aggression, there also needs to be this lane aggression into playing towards your lanes, because that's generally going to dictate how much pressure you can put on the enemy jungler. And generally, you have to decide what lanes you're going to play towards within the entire game, because some lanes will generate more pressure than others, and then some lanes will just naturally lose a lot of pressure, and you have to determine which ones you want to either help to gain a lead, or to even snowball a lead and snowball someone's favorable matchup, or to keep someone afloat, because maybe you might need them in the later parts of the game. And this is generally due to those slow building champions, right? Champions that are very slow scaling, but once they get to late game, they are complete carries, right? So you kind of have to keep some of those lanes afloat in order to have late game insurance, and to be able to say that you could win the late game pretty much no matter what, if these types of champions are going to be relevant within the later parts of the game. So junglers, I believe, have one of the hardest roles to go from solo queue to competitive, and this is to contribute to some of these other things in which you have to know about even lane matchups themselves. You have to know exactly how a lane matchup should go and who should have priority within a lane, so that then you can determine your jungle routes and determine which lanes that you may want to gank later that should have priority. You also have to determine how your players are going to match up in terms of the other players. Maybe you don't have Bjergsen and you're playing against Bjergsen, and obviously your mid laner isn't as good as his, so maybe you want to play towards a different lane, because even though he might be in a favorable matchup, it's Bjergsen, so he's not going to be able to eke out the same advantages that he can. Not only that, but Bjergsen has been notoriously susceptible, or unsusceptible I should say, to ganks, so he's really not going to ever feed in an entire game. His his medium as far as being a good player is very solid, so you'll hardly ever see that. So maybe you want to play towards a different lane. So these are the types of things that you have to consider when you go from solo queue to competitive, and also because you're playing with the same players over and over again. So not only do you have to realize that there are certain habits of what the enemy does in terms of what specific players or specific teams, but also that your own players and their own habits. And so you have to work off of those in the nuances of your teammates, whether those be strengths or weaknesses. Not only that, but you have to consider the traditional routes that you do as a jungler, maybe within solo queue. You can't do those anymore. Sometimes you have to take an inefficient route because that's a route which is unassumed from both the enemy team, but more specifically the enemy jungler, so he doesn't know where your pressure is exactly going to be. So this is something in which you could try and exchange in terms of actual good, theoretical, efficient jungle paths and throw off the enemy team in order to get maybe a surprise gank or a surprise objective, such as a dragon or a Rift Herald or maybe an extra camp to get ahead on experience, and then you could snowball that experience to what I had said before. Maybe you're level 6 versus the level 5 jungler. So all these things need to be taken into account. And also, not only that, as you transition from solo queue to competitive, you're also just a rookie jungler, right? It's very hard to command or deny players when they ask for help. Maybe a player that is a veteran bot laner, fucking Piglet, demands that you play towards his lane. And it's very hard to go against that because jungle is one of the roles in which you need to be assertive, because you essentially see the entire map from a bird's eye view, right? You can look at each lane objectively and then determine which lane that you want to play towards. But with that objectivity also comes with the burden of knowledge, and that you need to actually know some of these lane matchups, and you need to know kind of how they ebb and flow, and which parts maybe your teammate is more powerful or which parts the enemy is more powerful. And so going to one of the most thought-provoking things that I had heard from a pro player was with an interview I had with Meteos, in which he had basically said that as a jungler, you can't be everywhere at once, right? So essentially you have to be assertive on where you spend your time. And some laners aren't actually going to agree with that, and so you'll be at odds even with your teammates when it comes to where you should spend your time as a jungler. So it's very difficult to grasp that as a rookie jungler when you're trying to get your bearings, especially within a team that maybe has a lot of veterans on it. So junglers, I believe, seem to be misunderstood when they're assertive, and to say that essentially people may think that they're being a dick when in all actuality they're just saying what they believe is the correct thing to do from their point of view, which may be a more all-encompassing point of view rather than your point of view if you're a laner and you're his teammate, in terms of how the game should be played out, or maybe where early game jungle pressure should be, or if a jungler should farm up instead. So these types of perspectives might be misunderstood when a jungler says, no, I'd rather farm right now, or no, I want to go top lane instead of bot lane. And so this, I think, in part is why you actually do get aggressive personalities such as, I Will Dominate, or Tarzan, or Meteos, or Dardoch, etc. The list goes on, and you can actually see that there are these kind of, I guess, quote unquote, toxic players, players that realistically are just quite assertive, and they pretty much know what they want within the game, and they want a specific thing of laners to do, and they also try and look at, to some extent, holistically about the entire game state and then where to go from there. And so they are so assertive to where they kind of overburden maybe some particular laners when it comes to their ideas of how they want the early game state to be. And a really selfish laner and an assertive, or alpha jungler, as I would call it, is probably a pretty bad pairing, right? Especially if you have multiple assertive laners or selfish laners and a alpha jungler, because they're just going to clash in the ideas in which they think are the early game. And not only that, but it's the fact of the matter of, if you can't actually get together how you want your early game to pan out when it comes to just a team environment, then you're never going to realize those later stages of the game, right? So if you never get your early game together, you're never going to get to mid game, or you're never going to get to late game to see how your team plan or your team identity molds even further, to where maybe other people have responsibility towards the mid game or the late game more, right? Maybe the support ends up shot calling for the mid game or the late game. So you never really get to that point if you're a bad team. So if there is people at odds against each other, it is really going to harp on the jungler and kind of affect his entire mentality, but also just the viewpoint that other people may have on him as well too. Because it is no lie, the jungler is one of the most hated roles, both within, I think, solo queue and competitive League of Legends. I think that's probably one of the things that is most translated, although it's not one of the brightest things about both spheres, but I think they combined in that sense. And one of the repeated tenets of jungling that I've heard throughout my years of both playing and years of watching esports or League of Legends is that to never gank a losing lane. And I don't know where particularly, I don't remember where this idea came from, but it's the idea that if you gank a losing lane, they might not even know how to use that advantage because they lost so hard in the beginning. And so this can also, this is more specifically attuned to solo queue, but this can also translate into pro play as well too. If you have someone who maybe just is really not that great of a laner, then why would you want to play towards him? That's not even your strength anyways. And say, yeah, maybe you could keep the ship afloat by bringing this guy back up from underwater, but at the same time you have these entire other advantages that you could be gaining, which may actually equalize the entire game state. And so therefore you just end up having this early game plan of keeping this guy afloat, and then you have no later portions of how you can actually play out the game because you had put your attention on this guy that really is just a liability himself. So this can be entirely frustrating as a laner, both in solo queue and in competitive too, because you look at your lane state and you see that you're losing pretty hard, and then you maybe might blame the enemy jungler, or you might blame your own jungler because of what pressure is being exerted on your lane, or whether you have a losing matchup or whatnot, whatever those multitude of factors. Generally, not ever saying that it might actually be your own fucking fault, which is one of the most ridiculous notions of all. And I think that also proves to show that you aren't even about improving itself. It's that you would just rather put that blame on someone else in order to stave off the incapability of improving your own laning capabilities. But that's another conversation. So sadly, I think junglers, they walk on this crazy tightrope of being assertive but also not being rude at the same time, right? It's this entire balancing act. And in terms of personality, this might be the most misunderstood role. And the social ineptitude of both the jungler and the laners could often result in unnecessary tension because, I mean, let's fucking be honest. We're all gamers. We're all people who have played the game for this certain amount of time, whether that be if you're a regular casual player that is maybe invested in that, or especially if you're a pro player. You probably just haven't developed the social skills in order to deal with this tension and to untie the tension and undo it, whether from the perspective of the jungler or the laner. So I think this is probably the biggest problem of this role in pro play and why it's so hard for junglers to slot into a team. It may not be the hardest role in terms of transitioning, from gameplay to pro play in terms of solo queue to competitive play within, the LCS or the LCK or the LEC, whatever. I think that's certainly debatable. But I do feel as though the personalities that are attached to this role are often those who know how they want to play the game. And this could lead to disagreements about how to play the game in terms of strategy. So I think just the whole idea of the alpha jungler is entirely misunderstood. And with that comes with the probability of there being this unnecessary tension and this idea in which both viewpoints actually aren't taken into account. And so therefore, when you have that, you end up having these alpha junglers, which are often viewed as very toxic and incapable of playing with anyone else within the entire competitive scene when it comes to pro play.